Muito bom dia. Eu começo por cumprimentar o Laboratório Colaborativo enquanto organização desta conferência Trabalho 4.0 na pessoa do Sr. Presidente da Direção, Dr. Carvalho da Silva. Cumprimento também todos os associados do CoLABOR e membros dos órgãos sociais. Faço um agradecimento ao excelente painel de oradores que temos hoje aqui, do ponto de vista internacional, muito em especial Uma Rani, que aqui me acompanha como oradora deste painel, a todos os que se inscreveram e quiseram de alguma forma partilhar as temáticas que estão hoje aqui em estudo e em discussão, e a toda a equipa que garantiu que o dia de hoje e que esta conferência seja de facto uma realidade. Muito obrigada. Eu começo por me apresentar. Eu venho de Campo Maior, chamo-me Isabel Raminhas e represento aqui o Grupo Nabeiro Delta Cafés, que por sinal é também, como já vimos aqui, um dos associados fundadores deste laboratório colaborativo do CoLABOR. Trago-vos em primeira linha, da parte do Comendador Rui Nabeiro, administrador e fundador do grupo, uma mensagem de confiança, de estímulo, de valorização e de reconhecimento por tudo aquilo que tem sido feito ao longo dos tempos nesta área do laboratório para o trabalho, emprego e proteção social, vindo de alguma forma a cumprir aquele que é o nosso propósito inicial. Estar aqui hoje para mim e para o Grupo Nabeiro, eu diria que tem um significado muito especial. Penso que este significado será extensivo a todos os associados e que é partilhado por todos, uma vez que se trata do nosso primeiro ato público. Um dia de trabalho, um dia de reflexão, de discussão, em debate de um tema tão importante como é a tecnologia, o trabalho e o emprego no século XXI. Este momento é também uma meta para todos, uma vez que, desde o primeiro momento, acreditamos nas questões do trabalho, do emprego e da proteção social e que, por isso, somos hoje parte integrante deste grande desafio que é o trabalho humano na indústria 4.0. Permitam-me que faça uma breve contextualização do porquê do Grupo Nabeiro Delta Cafés aparecer hoje aqui nesta conferência e ser associado fundador deste projeto. O Grupo Nabeiro Delta Cafés é um grupo de empresas, conta hoje com sensivelmente 30 empresas e atuamos em diferentes e variadíssimas áreas de negócio. Mas, como todos sabemos, o nosso foco principal, a nossa atividade principal é a torrefação e a comercialização de cafés. Então poderíamos interrogar-nos porquê é que estamos hoje aqui. Porque é que o Grupo Nabeiro aparece como sócio fundador de um laboratório colaborativo para o trabalho, para o emprego e para a proteção social? Porque é que um torrefator de café, por excelência, entra no estudo, na investigação, na avaliação de impacto, quando falamos de inovação tecnológica, de informação digital, de robótica, de plataformas digitais? Porquê? Eu penso que é simples, porque afinal o debate aqui não é mais do que o impacto das tecnologias no trabalho. Eu diria que esta resposta do porquê do Grupo Nabeiro neste pequeno, grande projeto, e eu diria pequeno porque estamos a começar, grande pela dimensão e complexidade que ele ganha, dizia que a resposta é muito simples e muito desprovida de complexidade para quem conhece o grupo, por um lado, e para quem conhece a sua primeira pessoa e o seu rosto, que é o Comendador Rui Nabeiro. A resposta são claramente as pessoas. As pessoas e a sua capacitação, a promoção dos seus talentos, a qualidade de vida no trabalho e fora dele, na sociedade, na família, a formação técnica, mas também a capacitação socio-relacional, a proximidade, a motivação, o compromisso, o sorriso. Enfim, a resposta está mesmo nas pessoas. Estamos aqui pela sua imaginação e pela sua felicidade. Ao longo dos mais de 50 anos de existência da Delta Cafés, as pessoas assumiram sempre, mas sempre, e continuarão a assumir genuinamente um papel diferenciador para que possamos garantir sucesso e competitividade. E sem me alongar muito, permitam-me que cite aqui o porquê da Delta Café estar aqui. Mais uma vez, fazendo um breve histórico àquilo que é a nossa realidade. Não terá sido, talvez por acaso, que nós fomos a primeira empresa no ano de 2003 certificada no âmbito da responsabilidade social. Isto é uma manifesta e demonstrada preocupação com as pessoas. Fomos já este ano a primeira, e penso que até ao momento a única empresa certificada na área da conciliação para a vida pessoal, profissional e familiar. Estamos capacitados com um centro de formação, que não é mais do que um pivô estratégico na capacitação do capital humano, antecipando de alguma forma a capacidade de resposta e de adaptação aos desafios do nosso século. Contamos com uma associação de solidariedade social que tem provas dadas e trabalho feito, mas que tem uma grande aposta nas crianças e nos jovens, trabalhando aquilo que é o ADN ruinabeiro e a metodologia do empreendedorismo. Também, por outro lado, apoiando a faixa etária dos idosos na sua qualidade de vida e na sua dignidade. Ou seja, somos um grupo que tem trabalho feito com as pessoas e por isso não poderíamos deixar de estar aqui. Estamos ao longo dos anos também em estreita parceria, sempre com a saúde e com o ensino superior. Mas, por um lado, e permitam-me que cite aqui a nossa administração, os colaboradores da Delta Cafés são o ativo mais valioso da empresa. Por outro, ela não deixou de acompanhar a significativa evolução tecnológica que temos vindo assistindo nos últimos anos. A informatização de processos, a presença de robôs, as linhas de produção, o predomínio da informação digital são hoje uma realidade presente em grande escala nas nossas empresas. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, e para quem tem como eu o privilégio de partilhar os dias com o comendador Rui Nabeiro, é muito comum nós ouvirmos no discurso direto e na primeira pessoa frases como precisamos das pessoas para dar força à força. E a força aqui é a tecnologia. Não temos que trabalhar mais, mas temos que trabalhar melhor. E já hoje algo parecido foi dito aqui pelo Sr. Ministro. Temos que ganhar tempo para usar as novas tecnologias com a imaginação. E aqui temos novamente no primeiro lugar as pessoas e depois a imaginação delas ao serviço da tecnologia. E posso dizer-vos que ainda esta semana comentava o nosso administrador, no final da semana passada, peço desculpa, que a aquisição de um robô para a área dos contentores de café verde que nos chegam vai acontecer. Mas vai acontecer porque são precisas as máquinas. Mas dizia-me ele, não há máquinas sem homens, mas elas, as máquinas, podem torná-los mais felizes. Toda esta atitude que vive e convive com a forte presença dos recursos tecnológicos, posso dizer-vos que não tem contribuído de forma nenhuma para diminuir os postos de trabalho. A nossa realidade tem sido um aumento paralelo da tecnologia e um aumento paralelo dos postos de trabalho. Somos hoje mais de 3.500 pessoas. É também esta a razão porque um grupo com caminho feito em matéria de responsabilidade social tem de estar presente e assumir o seu compromisso em iniciativas como a criação deste laboratório colaborativo e assim poder aprofundar conhecimento de problemas presentes e antecipáveis em torno do trabalho, do emprego, da proteção social, da economia social e solidária. Ainda no passado domingo de Páscoa, e desculpem abusar de algumas expressões que são da autoria do nosso líder, mas é mesmo o nosso líder, num canal de televisão, durante a manhã, o senhor comendador dizia: o meu estilo de trabalho é diferente. Temos muita coisa mecanizada e robotizada, mas o trabalho está lá. As máquinas não estão para eliminar o posto de trabalho. Também hoje de manhã, ao início da manhã, o Dr. Carvalho da Silva dizia aqui que não temos que pensar na tecnologia e nas máquinas, mas temos que pensar nas pessoas e a forma como elas a vão usar. São as pessoas, a sua felicidade, o grande desafio para a evolução do Grupo Nabeiro. Assim, eu penso que uma articulação eficaz entre a tecnologia e o lugar do trabalho humano no futuro pode ser a chave para efetivar o sucesso. Sem mais demoras, eu passava a apresentar o painel, a apresentar a nossa oradora, que penso que estamos todos expectantes pelo conteúdo da sua mensagem. O painel que se segue intitula-se A Economia das Plataformas, Oportunidades e Desafios para Trabalhadores e Empresas. Para nos falar destes desafios e destas oportunidades, está connosco Uma Rani, economista sénior do Departamento de Pesquisa da Organização Internacional de Trabalho. Antes de ingressar na OIT, trabalhou como professora associada no Instituto de Pesquisas para o Desenvolvimento de Gujarat, na Índia. O seu principal foco de interesse e pesquisa é a economia do desenvolvimento, o setor informal, os salários mínimos, a pobreza, a desigualdade, as políticas sociais e de género. A sua atual investigação concentra-se nas plataformas digitais, na interação entre as instituições sociais e as políticas públicas como uma das formas de moldar os padrões de desigualdade económica e social. Recentemente, publicou e é coautora de um relatório sobre as plataformas de trabalho digital e o futuro do trabalho, intitulado Rumo ao Trabalho Decente no Mundo Online. Ficamos agora aproximadamente 45 minutos com Uma Rani na sua exposição e de seguida teremos um período para colocar questões. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to come and speak to you at CoLABOR. And I would also like to thank my colleagues at the ILO Lisbon office, Mafalda, for actually inviting me also over here to come and talk. I'm going to speak in English. I'm sorry. I've been following most of your discussion this morning in Portuguese, and it has been quite fascinating. And what I'm going to talk to you is going to be basically building upon what we have discussed before the coffee break. So the way I've organized this presentation is to talk about the platform economy and talk about what are the opportunities and challenges for both businesses and as well as for workers. We at the ILO have been doing quite a bit of work around digital labor platforms, and we have also published a report last year. And we are undertaking a huge project on understanding both the business side as well as the workers' side in the coming years, and we plan to bring out a report next year for the World Employment and Social Outlook, which is on digital economy and new business models. How do you ensure fair competition for businesses and decent work for workers? So it's with that light what I'm going to present to you is based on it, and I'm going to first start my presentation by looking at what are the opportunities that are there for businesses. So the way I've outlined the presentation is basically by looking at how businesses are actually enabled by digital platforms, in which of the sectors have they actually penetrated. There's been a lot of discussion that has been happening around with regard to whether the digital business or the digital platforms, have they been in any way trying to disrupt business, and which types of business have they been disrupting. We don't know too much in depth about it, but I'll just show you a sort of a glimpse as to what is happening. And then I'll try to show you through a mapping exercise that we are trying to do, saying, how do traditional companies actually use digital platforms? That's quite interesting, and I think there's not so much of work that's been done, and so that's one of the areas where we are looking at it. And I briefly talk to you about what are the possible opportunities and challenges that are there. This is not based on our own research, but it is based on a desk review that we have done. And then I'll get into a terrain which I'm much more familiar with, which is the digital labor platforms. And here I'll talk to you about the types of digital labor platforms, how they are actually distributed across the world, what are the basic characteristics, and get down to some of the opportunities and challenges. So coming down to the business model. So, when we talk of digital platforms today, there's a lot of hue and cry about what is it. And I think the most popular one that we do know about is either Uber, because it affects us through our daily life, or it is Deliveroo. What we tried doing is we tried actually looking into what are the different types of businesses that are coming up. Now, surely digital platforms, on one hand, while they are talked about disrupting or destroying businesses, they're also creating a lot of businesses. So you do have a lot of startups coming in. So what we have tried to do is actually classify the existing business. This is not very comprehensive, but it is very important from the labor side and also understanding it from the business side of it. So we have classified them into 4 actually categories. On the left-hand side is the aggregator platforms. I think many of us have been using it since the early 90s or late 90s. These are the Expedias, TripAdvisors, and the new ones that have come up, which are the Twitter, eBay, and Pinterest. The second ones are the labor reintermediation platforms. Why do we call as reintermediation platforms? The reason why we have got into these terms is, if you look at the left-hand side, aggregator platforms, they are basically linking a consumer directly with the producer or with a service provider. There's no intermediation that is there. Whereas on the right-hand side, what you see is the labor reintermediation platforms, where you have an intermediary platform that actually exists. Now, this could be in the form of an app, or it could be in the form of an app platform. So the most common ones that we all know is Uber or Deliveroo for delivery workers. If you look at some of the high-level macro task platforms that are there, they are the Upwork or People Per Hour. Then you also have software development platforms, which also do a lot of projects like Topcoder, HankRank, and all of them. And then you have the Amazon Mechanical Turk, which does a lot of low-end tasks. And then you have a number of other platforms where you do low-end services like Urban Clap, or you have TaskRabbit in the US. And then, actually what you have is, for these platforms to survive, you have a number of development platforms that exist. And these development platforms are actually developing to produce complementary products and services through what is called as an application program interface. Now, to give you a simple example, suppose if you have a task that you want to outsource it to a company, what you do is you don't go anymore to a company, you might go to a platform, and this platform could be an Upwork. So you go and say, fine, I'm looking for some legal services to be done or patent services to be done. So they provide you this platform, but along with it, they provide you with a number of other tools. And these tools are what is coming out of the development platforms. And this is where you have a huge number of startups and small businesses that have come in. So these platforms actually develop things like Dropbox, Slack, Google Docs, and all of it. So these interlink with the existing platform and provide a number of services. And finally, all of this exists because of what we call it as the financial platforms. What's very interesting to observe is that since the 2008 financial crisis, one was wondering, where was money being invested? Where did all the venture capitalists actually go? What's quite fascinating to see is, if you really track down the history of venture capitalists, you'll find that a number of venture capitalists have actually gone about investing in platforms. And not only have they invested in platforms to have these startups and platforms operating, but also what's interesting is that you have a lot of financial services and tools that have come by. So if you're going to use an Uber or any other app, what's interesting is you either are linked in your payment through PayPal or through an app wallet. Now, this app wallet is a new product that has come up because of these financial services, and they are being provided. So, for a functioning of a particular platform today, you have layers and layers, sub-layers of tools, services, and what is also called as Internet of Things that actually help support and function. So as a result of it, what you find is that you have a number of businesses actually coming into place. Now, if you look at which are the industries that platforms have actually emerged in? They have actually penetrated into a number of sectors. The first ones that they penetrated was in computers, then it was the telecommunications through the entire platform of mobile operating system, both the iPhone and the Android. They are the two major operating systems on which most of these platforms today function. Then you have the banking sector, where you have a number of electronic payments that have come in. Then you have the most popular one is the video games for consumer electronics, and then transportation, logistics, and hospitality. This is again something most of us use, whether it is the airline booking or package delivery or delivery workers actually delivering food from restaurants or from shopping malls. And then you have, within the retail sector, you have the barcodes, which have been in operation since the late 90s. You have the shopping malls, and then you have the eBay and the Etsy that have come in. And then what's little known is the energy sector, where this has made a big inroad, where you have a number of startup companies that have come up, where you can basically go and buy energy. And a lot of private companies are actually dealing with it. And then health is another big sector, less known, and this sector actually started with genomics and then went into biotech, electronic medicines, electronic systems, where electronic health records are today available to not only the private, but also across hospitals, telemedicine, and finally, it's within the education sector. Now, with regard to the disruption of business, there's been a study that's been come out in the Harvard Business Review, and it's very interesting to see how these companies are disrupting not only the traditional companies at times, but also their own type of business. So the first one is the Apple, which through its iPhone operating system of the mobile platform, basically disrupted the PC operating system, which was dominated by Microsoft Windows. And now the two major players there are Apple and Google, and Microsoft has reinvented itself and tried to come back into the market. The second is the Amazon, through the Amazon Marketplace, basically tried to disrupt the entire shopping malls and department stores, which were based on a similar structure. The third is Snapchat, which is a messaging app, and this actually disrupted the traditional communications, and one of the biggest companies that was affected was AT&T's SMS function. And then you have, within the taxi sector, Didi, which was a ride-sharing platform. It affected the taxi and limousine companies. The Beijing taxi got quite affected. And this is actually not just with Beijing. You see this phenomena with Uber in the US and many other countries. And finally, it's the Tencent, which through its app or through its entire QQ product, which actually is encompassing everything. It is social media, access to movies, messaging, everything, has actually disrupted the traditional communications, that is China Telecom. So you find very clearly that there are disruptions, but at the same time, you do see that there are a number of other opportunities that are coming by. What I've tried to do here is try to show you how traditional companies are actually using platforms. And today what you are getting is much more a kind of a hybrid approach. Now, this is not something that's happening today. And what's very interesting to see is that this change has been happening for almost a decade and a half, and it's only the realization now it's coming because I think there have been a lot of court cases that have come by which have made it very obvious that, traditional companies are actually using it. Now, what I've tried to do is use a kind of a typical firm and try to show how they use both the traditional linear kind of services as well as the platform base. It is not so that all traditional companies have moved towards platforms, rather they function in both arenas. That's what is quite fascinating about the way they function. Now, if you take a typical traditional company, all of its manufacturing or its services activities was either done in-house or it was at the most outsourced or subcontracted to other companies across the globe. And this is the case whether you look at the textile industry, whether you look at the automobile industry, or if you look at a company like Apple, which is in the IT sector. And many of these enterprises, because they were very large enterprises, within their own companies had a very large proportion of permanent workers, and then to basically meet with the constant seasonality and demand would have temporary and part-time workers. Now what has changed is that with the operation of operating system, mobile operating system, and with new products basically within the IT sector coming in, there's a larger realization that, well, you cannot use the traditional modes or traditional ways of going about doing your advertising, marketing your product, or selling your product. So you see first that there is a shift that happens in some of these areas. While you have some core staff, not too many of them, within your own industry, what you do is you basically outsource a lot of this to the platform. So what we have tried to do is try to see what are these activities that are actually getting off to the platform. So the first thing that we saw is that, well, you have a lot of these companies, like if you even take Apple for itself, Apple provides its platform, an innovative platform, so that a lot of startups can actually come and develop products and services. Because it provides a platform, there's no fixed cost. Startups have to basically pay variable costs to Apple to actually access it and develop new products and services. So you find as a result of it, a lot of startups and self-employed businesses actually coming into the game fray. So Apple does not anymore need to produce any of these products and services within the house. It can actually outsource it to the platform. The second thing that comes is labor reintermediation platforms. Here it's quite fascinating to see that you have different types of platforms today existing, as I showed before. So if you want major web designing or major projects to be sent, you either go to Upwork or Topcoder and basically get the work done there. Or if you have a lot of classification, categorization, and low-end tasks that have to be done, like testing of apps and all of it, then you have a whole range of platforms like Clickworker, Microworkers, Crowdflowers, Amazon Mechanical Turk, where you go. And at the same time, if you want to develop certain software development projects, then you have a whole range of software development programmers like Topcoder, HankRank, and all of them, where you can actually subcontract it. So in those cases, you have labor intermediation platforms that actually do it. You don't have to develop or within the house. Then you have cloud services today, where you can basically actually store all the data that you need and all of that you are collecting. And that data becomes today the most important tool. I don't get into that because that's in itself a big story. And then if you want to sell a lot of your products, you don't need to actually go to the traditional retailers. You do that, but it's only a certain proportion of it. But today, there's a lot of this being sold directly through e-commerce platforms. And then a lot of advertising, information, and other reviews. There's, again, a lot of labor intermediation platforms that exist. What's also quite fascinating to see is that companies like Apple or IBM actually submit about 20,000 patents per year. Now what happens is that, and they at the most don't win all the 20,000 patents, they win about 5,000 patents. Now traditionally, much of this patenting work was probably not done in-house, only a part of it was done in-house, and this was all subcontracted out to the law firms within the respective country, within the respective jurisdiction, because legality plays a very important role. What's quite interesting today is that many of these legal firms would traditionally actually further subcontract it out to companies in the global south. But today, they do not do that. They do part of it partially, but many of them actually use these platforms to actually verify whether any patent that is being applied has any meaning or not, whether it's already not been patented or not, and whether it is within the rules or not. So you find today a combination. It's not only the traditional big firms that are using it, but even within the subcontracted firms that are actually using platforms. Now, when you're talking about these startup companies, what are the opportunities and challenges that are there? Surely you see that I'm going to just quickly talk about the opportunities and then get into challenges, and then I'll talk about, again, the traditional companies in the same way. Now, if you look at the small startups that have been coming up or the platform companies that have been coming up, whether it's a ClickWorker or an Upwork or whatsoever, you very clearly see that there is an opportunity. So that has led to a huge proliferation of new businesses and startups because you don't have to anymore invest in basic infrastructure. The basic infrastructure is being invested by the big stars. And all you have to do is basically latch onto it and then try to see, okay, what's the new product or the service that you can actually bring about. So the asset base is pretty low, and only thing that you have to pay is a variable cost, and that is a fee for using that particular platform or the infrastructure. Now, what it also allows is that it allows complementary business to work together. So, two startup companies can actually get together and decide to work if they have certain niche areas to come up with products and services. So there's a very clear exchange that is there between business to business, and it is very good for innovation. This also allows network effects. Now, network effects is fundamental rule for platform economy. If you do not have network effects, and network effects is actually built through two sides, buyer, seller, it could be different combinations of it, but it's a very clear two-sided market that exists. And what it does encourage, apart from the network effects, why the network effects are also very important is that if you do not have any network effect, you do not have any economic value for your platform, which is the key determinant actually for existing in this particular market. Now, further, the way it is set up, it actually encourages a lot of innovations and development on complementary products, technologies, and services. And it actually allows both expansion and integration into different businesses. So, what happens often is that if you have a niche area in a particular product, and you find some other competitor coming in, you can basically buy over, or you can expand into other services so as to be much more competitive within the entire arena. And what you finally see is the emergence of new reintermediation or aggregator platforms providing a number of range of products and services. What's quite fascinating about this entire platform economy is that there are too many unknowns that are there. And because of these unknowns that are there, and because of the competition that is there, including malpractices within that, it allows a lot of new entrepreneurship and new players to actually get into the market and try to create a space for themselves. Now, while all of this is very good, the same issues can actually prove as a big challenge. One of the biggest challenges that one faces is its generation of trustworthy information. You never know whatever information you are getting on the website or the platform is true or not. It could be manipulated by your competitors. So you have to be always observant. And other thing that is very important is what are the legal boundaries on which they actually operate, which is the basic fundamental thing, especially when you move out of your own country and start operating in another country, whether you are actually following the rules of the game of that country or not. The second issue that comes up is ensuring strong intellectual property rights and appropriability mechanisms, because you might think that you're coming up with a product or service, but somebody else might already do it, or might compete with you, or might take that knowledge and actually apply for it. How do you actually ensure that there is absolutely no conflict of interest that exists, or you're not taking away somebody else's property rights? Further competition and conflict of interest could lead to business actually erecting very strong barriers, and this is something we increasingly see happening within the digital age. One of the major problems with startups that they face is that the minute a startup is doing very well, how does a startup do very well? It's basically through the network effects. The network effects then starts, that is the number of users that are actually lashed onto your application or your service or your platform. The minute you have millions of users lashed onto your application, the value of your service or your app actually goes up. Now, you then start becoming a competitor to some other another platform or another app. One of the famous cases of late has been the Facebook, which has first tried to buy Skype, and then it tried to actually buy WhatsApp. Now, WhatsApp was initially not willing to sell it to Facebook because it wanted its value to go up further, and later they went about actually agreeing to that development. So this high exposure to competition actually leads to envelopment of the platforms, and as a result you have one platform leader actually emerging in the entire process, which again starts changing the rules of the whole game. The other issue that's been seen is the pricing strategy to attract users, and there's not only the pricing strategy, but a number of other incentives that are given to the users to attract them towards either the app or the service provider so as to get a very high valuation. Now, this kind of a predatory pricing could not only destroy the economic value, but it can also disrupt business. And this is quite famous in the case of Uber, which to date has not had any profits. It's been on a loss. It has gone up to the IPO, but it has been using a predatory, highly subsidized price to actually compete out the traditional taxi companies. And this is where you again feel one realizes that you need policies to be put in place. And there's a huge dependence on network effects to thrive on the market and ensuring the entire two-sided market functions. If that is not there, then absolutely you're out of the game. Now, one of the challenges that you face as a result of it is how can you sustain your business strategy under these competitive conditions. And also what's quite interesting is, unlike in the traditional business where you had a lot of lending coming from banks, today you have a lot of lending actually that comes from the venture capitalists. And the venture capitalists are not going to invest in things if your business is not going very well. So the issue becomes, how do you sustain in a market like this? And this is for the startups quite a big challenge. Now, when it comes to the traditional companies, while they actually look at the platform economy as a big, big boon for themselves because they can actually reduce transaction and fixed costs because you have easy access to outsourcing a number of services, tasks to not only the platforms, but also third-party enabling platforms. And it provides them with the flexibility to actually undertake their business. And as there are very low barriers to entry, you can actually today access a global pool of labor 24/7. If you want the work done at this hour, you can actually get it done by outsourcing out to some workers in another part of the world where it's a day work. And you have access to a wide range of talents, ideas, and skills. So the pool of resources that you have at your hand is huge. And it also allows businesses to develop better targeted and innovative products and services because you do not have to only depend upon your own workers, but you can also actually outsource them out. It reduces very clearly the labor and employee-related costs, that is the social security and the training costs. It lowers the downtime on the unused capital, and it improves the organization of work and increases productivity and efficiency. Now, this is the argument that comes from the business, why they actually want to use these kinds of platforms. We are still doing quite a bit of work to basically verify many of the claims that are coming, but you can see in the literature many of it being argued, basically. Now, this has huge challenges when it comes to the workers. Now, what is happening is that though it has been argued to be kind of an efficient way of going about doing business, is that you have huge monitoring costs that are there. For every task, you have to actually manage the entire task design. What is a managerial practice? What is a pricing mechanism? How do you go about doing it? Sometimes when you get the task done, you're not sure whether the quality that you're getting is up to the satisfaction or not. Then the issue becomes whether it is your own in-house labor that is doing or not. Now, as a result of the platforms, what has happened is a lot of training and staffing costs have been pushed onto the workers. So there's absolutely no incentive for the worker within his own company whether to invest in certain kinds of skills or whether some of these tasks are going to go away. So there there is a lesser motivation that is there even for the workers within the organization. The other issue that we have seen with regard to the way the platform work gets outsourced is there are lots of malpractices, malicious practices that are actually happening, where some of the workers also use algorithms to do the work, and as a result, the quality of the work is actually very badly affected. Now, this has an impact on the quality and productivity issues with regard to the worker. Now, this was the entire business side of the whole game that I tried showing as to why businesses are actually interested in it. Now, the other part of the story is basically the digital labor platforms as to why is it that labor is actually interested in it and what are the challenges that are there. The challenges on labor, I didn't talk there, but I thought I would bring it here. Here, what I'm going to draw on is basically from the two big studies that we have done at the ILO. One is on the digital labor platforms and the future of work, which was a survey of about 3,500 workers across the globe on microtask platforms. And we also did specific work on Ukraine, looking at macrotask platforms, which was quite high-skilled. Now, when we talk of digital labor platforms, again, you can see actually two groups. One is a web online base, which I've talked about, and the other one is local app base, which is again something that I did show you within the business model. Now, what I'm going to talk to you, the results are largely going to be on the web-based models, which is the microtask platforms and the macrotask platforms. Now, the survey that we did actually covered about 76 countries. We had a higher sample of workers, largely from the US and India, because Amazon Mechanical Turk, one of the firms or the platforms that we were surveying, was largely based in these countries. Now, for this particular survey, we actually surveyed workers from 5 different platforms: Amazon Mechanical Turk, Crowdflower, Clickworker, Microworkers, and Prolific Academic. Crowdflower is today called as Figure 8, and Prolific Academic, which comes out of the Oxford University, is called today as Prolific. Now, one of the issues that comes up, and even when we started this work, was that many of these workers who are actually involved, it was argued was either it was young workers or old workers, and it was much more as a pastime work. Now, this myth has been completely burst, because I think studies after studies have come about showing that this kind of work is spread across both genders, and it is actually spread across all age groups. And this is what we actually see. We see that the average age of the worker using these platforms is about 34.5 years, and you find workers from the age of 18 to almost 75 years. So there's a real widespread range of workers who are actually engaged in it. What is very interesting is the education levels of the workers, because this is really very important. What you find is that a very high proportion of workers, especially in the developing countries, have university degree, and comparatively compared to in developed world. And you find that lower levels of education are comparatively low. And one of the reasons for this is that you need some level of computer literacy to actually be able to access computers and any of these tasks. And we found that about 56% of the workers were actually active doing crowd work for more than a year. So this notion that exists that people do it for a short time, that this is a transmitted phenomena, that this will go away, this does not seem to be true. And we have another study where we have tried showing that there's a considerable number of workers who actually work for more than 5 or plus years, and they are very highly dependent upon crowd work as a major source of income. So this is not necessarily a time pass or an additional source, but it is a major source of income for many workers. And for this survey, it's almost about 54% of the workers. Now, when you look at the opportunities for workers, what's been argued is basically that many of them get access to the global labor markets. So they don't have to physically migrate today, they become virtual migrants. The second issue, the way platforms advertise this work and the way workers also look at it at times, is that it provides them with the flexibility to do the work at any time of the day from whichever place and wherever they want. And they can choose the tasks they want. But the reality shows a completely different picture. While there is flexibility, because of not having enough work, the workers are basically tuned to their computers 24/7. This is not a situation where you get up in the morning and you decide that you'll open up your computer and there will be tasks that are available. There are not actually so many tasks available as it is said. Though there are about every second 600,000 jobs or tasks come onto the platform, there are double the amount of such workers that are globally available that actually take away the work. So there has been a big issue with regard to the availability of tasks. Many of them have also argued, saying that they get access to a variety of tasks and there is some levels of skills learning. I think many people from non-English speaking countries have gone about arguing, saying that they have learned the English skills. But apart from that, there has not been much that we have seen, at least in the microtask platforms. This might be true for macrotask or software development platforms, where you do find a lot of skills being gained. It's an important source of income for basically those with disability or health problems and people with social anxiety. And this is a very good way of going about linking to the labor market and accessing work. It provides supplementary income. It reduces for many the mobility to work, especially in the developing world. And for many workers, especially women, they went about arguing, saying that this was a very good way of doing work because they can actually manage both household and care responsibilities. While on one hand, it could be argued to be good, there's the other argument within it saying that is the digital labor platform further pushing towards a new form of a social reproduction of labor, which is no different from what we saw in the earlier traditional labor market. Now, there are a number of challenges that exist. One is lack of clear employment relationship, low pay, availability of work during asocial hours, which leads to huge impacts on work-life balance, unfair treatment by requesters, lack of responsiveness, limited career paths, and lack of voice. I'm going to actually show you some more in detail with regard to it. Now, what do we mean by lack of regulation? Now, what's interesting is one of the arguments that has been made within this entire debate on digital economy, digital technology, digital platforms is that there's absolutely no regulation. Well, one has to be a bit careful. There's no regulation, which is a government regulation, but what's interesting is there is what is called as self-regulation. And this self-regulation actually comes from the platforms itself, which very clearly in its terms of agreement specify that the workers who are actually getting work through platforms will not get any of the benefits that their permanent workers actually get. So there is a regulation by the enterprise which very clearly specifies, which is to the detriment of the worker. The second issue is that while much of this debate on this lack of clear employment relationship has been that how do you classify these workers? Are they self-employed? Are they freelance workers? Or what are they? And here, again, the argument is if you are a self-employed worker, then you basically have autonomy and control over the job you do. But what's quite interesting is if you look at the terms of agreement, the service agreement, any of the platform that you take up, you easily find that you do not have either the control or the autonomy to actually undertake work. You very clearly specified that you cannot use scripts or bots to actually download any of the tasks or subcontract it out. So there's a kind of a wishy-washy that exists with regard to how your employment relationship is, because you're neither an employee, so because you're not an employee, AMT does not give you any of the benefits. On the other hand, you're told that you're a self-employed. If you're self-employed, you don't have control over your work because there's a huge dependency that is there. Now, within the Ukrainian study, what we found was quite interesting. We found that And this is interesting because these workers are called as freelancers. So they should have the autonomy to work whenever they want, right? But what you see is about 27% of the workers providing screenshots of work or have installed software that actually monitors the work. Now, this is no different from a wage employee. 36% of the clients request them to be available for certain hours, and then a considerable proportion also requests them to be available outside the usual hours of work. Further, 1 out of the 2 Ukrainian freelancers either have only one main client or have clients directly supervising work extension and controlling work processes. And finally, 85% pay a commission to the platform in order to work. So if you look at all these characteristics that are there, and look at amount of control that both the client and the platform have on you, it's very clear that this is not really a kind of a freelancer or a self-employed job. This quite a bit resembles that of a wage employee. Now, if you look at the distribution of hourly pay, a very large proportion of the workers actually do not get even the minimum wage. What we have tried to do in this graph is to show some 3 things. One is a distribution. It's plain distribution. It's a kernel density of how the wages are distributed across for all these workers. And we have taken 2 countries here, India and US, for comparison to show how the global north and the global south picture looks like. And then we further try to show how what the differences are between the gender. What you clearly see is that the vertical lines are the average wages that are there, which are far below the minimum wages in at least the US, not so much in India. But if you look at the distribution, you very clearly see that it's skewed towards left. If you compare the 2 countries, you find that the Indian workers are skewed much more towards the left compared to the American workers. And the reason why you actually see that is because the nature of tasks that are given to US workers and Indian workers are very different. So there's quite a bit of blocking and discrimination that happens. The other issue is that the other interesting thing that we also found is that there's very clear blocking of workers when certain tasks come in, so that some of the Indian workers cannot actually access high-end tasks even if they are actually available. And across genders, you find that there is almost a similar pattern, but there are huge differences that exist between American male and female workers compared to that of Indian workers. Now, this low pay differential was observed not only in this particular platform, but across a whole range of platforms. And what was quite interesting to see was that in the Ukrainian study, we found that the women workers were actually earning about 45% less than men, and this gap was actually much higher than what you saw it in the offline labor market. And the gap is, to a very large extent, actually explained by the occupational segregation of women in certain tasks. It was very interesting to see that men ended up being in IT-related tasks, whereas women ended up being in low-end tasks. So that was also one of the reasons why you have, for a raw gap, very high. But even when you actually adjust for it, there's quite a bit of gap that exists. The other thing that we observed was that when you actually control for a number of factors, you found that there was a huge differential that was there between US and Indian workers in the payment made. But when you actually adjust for the purchasing power parity, there is a sort of a reverse that happens. But when you still control for a lot of education characteristics and other basic characteristics, you still find US workers actually getting more than that of the Indian worker, which was quite interesting for us to see. Now, with regard to the fact that there is flexibility of work, what was being complained was that 88% of the workers said that there was insufficient work that was available, and this was across all the platforms. And many of the workers actually went about saying that they actually lose a lot of time actually looking for work, because these jobs are not easily available. You cannot have a bot or a script or something that you actually develop through which you could have access to n number of platforms and can get work easily. Whenever you want to do some work, you have to actually look for work and you have to spend a lot of time. We found that for every hour that a worker worked, they spend about 20 minutes doing unpaid tasks that was basically trying to look for work. The other issue that comes up, because of which you have very low pay, is a lot of work is actually rejected. Now, how does these rejections happen? There are two things that are very important within this context. Now, any task that is floated onto the platform is not done by one single worker. They are done by multiple workers, which is called as a majority voting system. So a task is given to 5 workers, and your algorithm is actually set up in a way that if 3 of the 5 people do it in a way, then that's correct, and 1 out of the 3 would be paid, and that is again decided by the algorithm on a random basis. So as a result of it, a lot of workers actually do the work but do not actually get paid, or sometimes they think they have done the work rightly, but the work actually gets rejected. And there's absolutely no mechanism for redressal or appealing or knowing why the work is rejected. This is very interesting that we did talk to somebody at Turk Opticon and AMT, basically, who went about saying that, well, the amount of payment that you have to pay for many of these tasks is so low, so you're not going to actually spend any time trying to send emails or trying to actually get between the worker and the client, trying to explain why the worker is rejected. So the interesting thing into the whole process is that work not only gets onto the platform today, but even your management is no longer by a human, but by an algorithm. The last one, which is a bit more disheartening, is about the kind of skills that many of these workers have and how they utilize, especially within the developing country context and within the microtask platforms. And this calls for actually a need for a very clear development policy and labor policy, not only among countries in the developing South, but also among countries in the global North. Now, what was quite interesting is we tried looking at the skills by STEM education, that is science, technical, engineering, and mathematics. And what's quite disturbing is that about 51 to 67% of these workers who are university graduates are actually engaged in these high-level skills, and it's much more higher within the developing compared to the developed countries. Now, what are the kind of tasks that these people do? I think we have all been talking about work being done on digital labor platforms, but what is a task? And we tried actually, through our survey, ask people what they do and classified them into 5 categories. They do a lot of online clerical and data entry tasks. They do online promotional activities like search engine optimization, for which I'll come in a minute, online writing and translation work, online AI and machine learning. It looks very highly technical, the terms that I use, but it is pretty dumb, low-end task. And they do a lot of online content moderation. So when you get onto the website today, when you don't see any hate speeches, war images, or pornography, you think that an AI has been built in and that actually takes care of it. Actually, that's not true. You have a huge human labor that actually goes about cleaning much of these tasks. Though the YouTube CEO went about in public saying that 98% of these are rejected through AI, but what he failed to actually say is that because of the 2% that is not detected, a lot of this work is done by human labor. Now, the example on the right-hand side that I want to show you is search engine optimization. Now, this, when you look at the term, it looks very hi-fi, it looks very technical, but what is actually that job? All that job does is it asks a worker to go to a particular platform, click on it, and basically stay on that particular platform for a while. Then it gives you a couple of options. It says that you will find 3 or 4 tools there. Just go click on it, stay there, and then you have to further go about clicking on it. Now, this example is very interesting for 3 reasons. Number 1, it shows discrimination. It very clearly says which are the countries that cannot participate. Second issue that it shows is the timing. It says it takes so much time to actually do the task. If you do a simple calculation of what a worker is supposed to do, you'll find it's much more than that. And the third thing, which is quite sad, is that you are actually promoting a particular website, a product, or a service actually through human labor or through, and this probably could be a machine learning tomorrow where you can build an AI or you can do it automatically that goes about. So, you're promoting products and providing reviews or providing fake reviews and actually creating a market where there's absolutely no market. So the issue that arises is the kind of skills that the workers have, is that the best way to utilize to promote a product or services, because that's what this industry has become, and that's where, in a big, big way, digital labor platforms are actually used. Now, when it comes to voice and workers' concern, how much is there? It's almost zilch. There is a bit of unions that have started getting interested in it, but the penetration is still at a very low level. What exists is social media, where and forums where many of these workers actually go and relate their experience and try to get some advice and try to move forward. So these are mechanisms that are there where they can go and voice out, but they do not help to provide them with either labor rights or protect them towards fair wages or social protection. So I think what we go about arguing is that we need some step towards decent work on online labor, digital labor platforms. I think what I heard on data labor this morning was quite interesting. And I think what needs to be done is that one is not arguing here saying that one does not need innovation and technology. I think one needs to embrace that very clearly, but I think we need much more than that. I think we need to see how the innovation and technology can actually help towards the development process. And towards that, we also go about arguing saying that you need fairer criteria for crowd workers, and we provide about 18 criteria which go into looking at the employment status, minimum wages, labor standard, social protection, and redressal mechanism, and mechanisms in a way that a client and a platform operator can actually have liaise with the worker or have much more exchange towards it. And there have been some attempts towards improving some of the rights of the working conditions, and I think I'll stop with that. Thank you very much for listening.
Bem, desde já muito obrigada pela excelente exposição com que nos brindou. Lamento ter que controlar o tempo, mas cabe-me a mim essa tarefa. Em jeito apenas de conclusão, se me permitirem, salientava 2 ou 3 pontos. De alguma forma, as plataformas digitais são hoje um fator de transformação radical na forma de conceber o negócio. Para as empresas, temos aqui claras vantagens aos níveis da latitude da oferta, da abrangência geográfica, dos horários e depois a salientar também aquilo que são os efeitos e os ganhos da rede. Em relação àquilo que são as plataformas digitais para os trabalhadores. Portanto, referiu que revelam-se também muito atraentes pela flexibilidade de horários, também pela dispersão geográfica e podemos estar do outro lado do mundo, pelo consequente reflexo que isso tem na produtividade e depois até pela articulação que nos permite com a vida familiar, pessoal, social, etc. 2 desafios também que me parecem importantes. O da fidelidade da informação com que somos confrontados. Ela é vasta, é diversa, é rica naturalmente, mas até que ponto é fiel? Penso que foi o que percebi. Por outro lado, um desafio também importante que tem a ver com a contextualização jurídica de tudo aquilo que nós temos ao nosso dispor. Portanto, até que ponto é que aquilo a que estamos a aceder é enquadrável e adaptável exatamente daquela forma naquilo que é a legislação do nosso país. Percebi também que, além das vantagens apresentadas para empresas e trabalhadores, ficam algumas preocupações no ar e que passam, por exemplo, pela garantia das condições dignas de trabalho, pela questão dos salários dignos, dos direitos ao sistema social, às regalias, à segurança social. A questão também da potenciação de talentos, uma vez que se perde aqui alguma proximidade, a questão da proximidade, a questão da relação, a questão da satisfação, ou seja, a questão da felicidade também dos trabalhadores. Mais do que uma questão, deixava também talvez uma preocupação, e em contraponto com as conclusões apresentadas, que seria qual é que será aqui a chave? Qual é que será o segredo para que empresas e instituições, como por exemplo aquela que eu hoje aqui represento, tendo no seu ADN um foco nas pessoas, como é que estas empresas podem fazer conviver e de uma forma equilibrada estas duas realidades? Ou seja, manter o foco na proximidade, no potenciar dos talentos, nas pessoas e em simultâneo usufruir de tudo o que são as vantagens destas novas tecnologias e hoje aqui nomeadamente das plataformas digitais. Ou seja, afinal, como é que esta indústria 4.0 e as ferramentas que ela hoje nos disponibiliza vão poder ser colocadas ao serviço das comunidades, por forma a garantir crescimento sustentável, garantir que empresários e trabalhadores trabalham para o mesmo lado e estejam felizes neste conceito de felicidade entendido em contexto laboral também. Muito obrigada mais uma vez. Eu ia passar agora a palavra para esse lado. Para ganharmos tempo, reuníamos um conjunto de questões e depois a nossa oradora fazia o favor de responder conjuntamente a jeito de conclusão. Ninguém tem questões? Não sei. Temos ali microfone. Faz favor.
I will speak in English, okay? My name is Isabel Raminhas. I'm from XXI, one of the members of the CoLABOR. And I listened to your presentation with a lot of interest. And I might confess that I'm very worried about it. I have worked for years in economics of innovation and even in technological change and employment. In a certain point in my life, I have also researched on that subject. But what I find in your presentation is that the new platforms are making possible for firms, for big companies to become more and more coordinators and less communities of people working together, because companies are externalizing functions, activities, workers, responsibilities, even in legal terms, fiscal terms, and etc. So I don't find, in fact, many opportunities for workers. I find opportunities that are a second best, a second choice. I'm really worried about all this overview that you have presented. And what I find is that probably we have to change all the legal framework regarding this functioning. Otherwise, the atomized workers that are split in really thin elements that have lost connections will be devoid of any legal possibility to protect themselves. And even governments will lose more and more the legal basis of fiscal income. What is happening now with big companies is all we know, and probably the situation is even worse than we were aware of. So I would like you, please, to comment on this. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nuno Boavida. I'm a researcher at the University of Lisbon. My question follows a little bit the previous one, which is how do you envisage strategies to organize and mobilize and defend these workers? Online forums were there in your graph. I find that very interesting. Do you figure out any other ways that these workers could actually come together and organize themselves to defend them worldwide?
Good afternoon. My name is Graça Quintas. I'm an employment lawyer, and I work basically with companies. I'm a corporate lawyer. So basically, to express also my concern, my major clients are multinationals, which have their workforce spread geographically in the world. Okay. And basically, what I notice is that this kind of issues and discussions that we are having nowadays are most centered on the employee part. However, we have, my opinion is that we have to work as a team, okay, all together, companies and workers, and these challenges that employees are facing are also being faced by companies. And as a corporate lawyer, my daily challenge would be, because my clients are basically foreign companies, which are placing workers in Portugal, which are spreading their workforce throughout the world and even in Portugal as well. And this concern that the audience is expressing, and of course I understand it, but I think that for us the basic challenge would be how to apply the current legislation to a scenario which is totally disrupted from the legislation that we have to apply. So basically we have, as lawyers, have to think forward and sort of compose the legislation that was built years ago, and it's not entitled to regulate this these digital dimensions, because the mobility, the organization of work, the working times, the flexibility, and even the compatibilization with the private life and the professional life, the right to this connection of the employees. This has to be dealt with in a jointly way, and not only employees
and companies. So basically, that would be my comment to that as a corporate lawyer, because this is a very challenging time for us. And we hope for better legislation, that we hope that platforms like CoLABOR help us to interpret and somehow have data that is willing to change also the legislation in a way that companies have the tools also to protect their employees. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for these three very good and useful questions. And I think the first person who commented, I think you actually put everything in a nutshell very nicely. I think that's my concern, that's my worry. I think what I've tried to do here is give a sort of a balanced view, in a sense, bringing about what the opportunities are there, but at the same time raising the challenges. But when you look at it from the worker's side of view, I think what you said was exactly right. This is the second best choice that a worker has. And that raises a fundamental question today for us, saying that, isn't it time for us to take a bit more seriously about what our employment policies should be? Or how do we actually link the entire issue of innovation and technology with development? I think we have somehow, and this links to the third point that was being raised, and also links to some of the questions that you have been raising, both of you have been raising, is that much of the legislation that exists today are the legislations coming from the industrial age. And I think we are applying the same liability principle, the same corporate principles within the entire juncture. And what has modified quite to an extent is a bit on the subcontracting systems, because they are the ones that have come up from the 70s, 80s onwards in a big way. So, to an extent, we know what those joint liabilities or between firm liabilities that are there. But I think the entire digital age thing has not been really looked at. And that's where the biggest worry is. And if you look at you just mentioned about it, about fiscal resources not being there. One of the biggest challenges we are facing, and this was discussed earlier this month at the e-commerce week in UNCTAD, was the entire issue about temporary and permanent moratorium on electronic transfers being pushed by certain sets of countries. What does that mean? The minute you have permanent temporary moratoriums on electronic transfers, you're not going to get any tariffs, any customs duty to the government. So the issue is, what are the cuts that you're going to have? You're going to have huge cuts in your social protection budgets. The other issue that's coming in a big way is taxation. None of these platforms are actually taxed. Neither the platform operators being taxed, nor the client is being taxed, nor the workers being taxed. So because of that, again, the tax revenues of many of the countries are being lost. So the issue then becomes, on one hand, there's also this debate saying, let's have the technological revolution, but at the same time, let's go about giving universal basic income. The issue that is never explored there is, what is the level of this universal basic income that you're actually talking about, and where are the resources going to come by? I think there are certain countries like Sweden or Denmark, because of its population or because of its historical picture, where they have had a very clear social welfare state kind of a model, you can go about giving that. To what extent that is really applicable in many of the developing countries is a larger question. So I think it is time that we need to really talk about what kind of legal institutions that are actually needed to address much of this work. Now here, there's a bit of a different view I do want to take, and I think, what's very interesting, at least within the EU regime that I've seen, is that while we have been actually saying a lot on the employee relationship and the status of employment of the employee, EU has not actually taken this issue up in a big way. It's talking about it because there has not been so much of consensus among the member state countries. But what's very interesting is that when it comes to businesses, there's actually a draft law that is there for fair competition for businesses, which is quite interesting in a sense. So it's not that this has been overlooked. No, it's actually on the front table, and it's been under discussion to ensure that fair practices are there. But I think what's important is to look at this in a much more holistic way, both looking at employers and looking at what does it mean for workers. And if this is the way that we want to look at work tomorrow, how do you actually regulate it? And I think towards this, we in the Global Commission report on Future of Work, which has recently been released, very clearly talk about time sovereignty, and we do talk about how technology can be used and harnessed to actually improve the quality of work. And here, actually, what was very interesting this morning, also talking on behalf of Data Labor, the colleague who was presenting, was how could you have kind of a monitoring mechanisms using technology to ensure that actually the workers get certain rights, get certain benefits, and have some sort of a protection. You could use technology in a much more progressive way towards it. But that doesn't mean that technology or legal issues alone can solve the problem today. I think we need a much more wider, broader debate where you have the society, you have governments, you have employers and workers actually talking about how do we want to take this labor issue for. I think labor is central. I think we cannot forget that into this whole debate. One can argue about, and I think this was very nicely put up, saying that, you know, business was something which worked very holistically in a coordinated way, taking everybody into consideration and going about for the development of the society. Now, that's not what you see with the externalization of services and businesses, and that's where the atomization of production and services is happening, and we cannot really go down that road. I think before it goes to complete extremes, we have to find a midway kind of a solution. Now, with regard to the second question that was raised with regard to, you know, is there a sort of social forums or social media that is there? What's quite interesting is that when we did this work, we were under the presumption that much of these forums are actually managed by workers. But more and more interviews with platform operators comes to our knowledge saying that quite a lot of these forums are actually managed by the platform operators themselves, basically to address some of the issues of the workers, but also to actually get the workers to be working onto the platforms. Now, this issue of global dispersion of labor and collectivizing and organizing them has always been a sort of a problem. And this is something we have traditionally seen in the home-based work community, especially within the developing country context. But actually what's very interesting and what we have observed now is that there are a number of new initiatives that are coming up which are trying to collectivize and actually mobilizing these workers to make them realize about their rights. But again, there is a sort of difficult point that is there because workers are competing against each other to get the job. Many of them do not really want to get to you to form into a forum or fight for the rights. So, you know, it is like survival of the fittest. And that's exactly what you see within this industry. And that's why that's one of the biggest challenges that we see in collectivizing them. I think there is an attempt now towards cooperative platformism that is happening, and you see that a bit more in Asia than in other parts of the world, but I think it's all in the nascent stage, and I think the coming years will say, you know, how you can sort of try to mold them in a way that they can be much more effective in strategizing their demands and fighting for their rights. Thank you.
Bem, muito obrigada a todos, também pelas questões que se permitem sempre aprofundar o debate neste nosso tema, a economia das plataformas, oportunidades e desafios para trabalhadores e empresas.